Florida lawmakers are considering a draft law to strengthen state control over sex education that its sponsor says would ban any instruction in schools about menstrual cycles before the 6th grade. Yeah, that's the ridiculousness that's inspired today's video. I've said in previous videos that I'm a big believer that the first step towards preventing something bad is education. I'm all about education, education, education. Really important to me. I think it's great. You can't just try to shut people's eyes to the world and hope that a bad thing stops existing. Ignorance undoubtedly is what gets people into trouble so often. And I think this idea is not only true for adults, but for kids too. If you want kids to avoid something that is bad and harmful to them, you have to provide them with a comprehensive education about the topic. Now, this doesn't just apply to sex education laws, although we're going to be talking about that later. This also applies to pretty much any topic you can think of. Take drugs as an example. I imagine not many parents out there want their kids to try drugs, right? Right? So how do we prevent that from happening? We've seen time and time again that locking kids in a house and pretending that issues like drugs don't exist just doesn't work, because at some point a person, whether when they're an adult or while they're still a kid, is going to come into contact with drugs at some point in their life. And when that happens, you need to ask yourself, do you want your kid to make a choice that is well thought out, informed and sensible, or would you rather they're forced to make a split-second decision based on fear or insecurity or ignorance? If you don't want your kids doing drugs, the first step is to explain to them, what are drugs? Where might they encounter them? What are the effects these drugs are going to have on them, including both the good and the bad things? And then providing them with the skills and the self-esteem they need to value their own body, to want to take care of their own body and themselves, to feel strong enough about making decisions for themselves instead of, for example, always giving in to peer pressure. You have to be real and honest with your kids and not lie to them. So, as an example, let's take a pretty horrific drug like meth, for example. Sure, if you show them just the bad sides of meth, you show them pictures of people with severe dental problems, tell them about issues with blood pressure and heart attacks, show them skin problems, tell them about the organ damage it can cause, and so on, you might get to a point where you scare your child into avoiding it, at least for a while. But chances are, if they ever come into contact with it in the real world, then they're going to actually start wondering, well, why do these people take it? There must be something in it. They can't just be doing it because they want heart problems. And if they're around someone who is trying to sell this drug to them, then that person is going to go into full promo mode. They're going to tell them about how great it makes them feel and all these wonderful things, and they're going to sell the drug. Your kid is potentially going to be in a stressful situation, bombarded by new information to them, and perhaps start thinking, well, why didn't I hear about these good things before? Why did no one tell me this? Have I been lied to? What else is a lie? And perhaps they'll want to try it for themselves. But if they find themselves in that situation and instead they're like, well, I've heard these are the good things, but these are the bad things, they can weigh up the pros and cons for themselves and make an actual informed decision, which is going to lead to better choices, healthier choices, safer choices. Isn't it better to provide all the information up front and let them come to these conclusions for themselves, instead of being forced into making emotionally charged, maybe scary decisions on a split second? Now, of course, this isn't true for all people. There's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to this sort of education, and I'm absolutely not saying if you don't fully educate your kids about every drug out there, then they'll take all the drugs and die. No. A lot of the time it comes down to the individual, and sometimes just scaring them into not taking drugs or locking them away from the world is going to work for some kids, but not for all. On the whole, in general, when we talk about the majority of people out there, the best way to prevent drug use starts with a good, quality, comprehensive education on the topic, as well as, of course, other things like making sure the person has a good support system around them and so on. Education can't exist in isolation, but it's definitely the first big step forward. And I'm a big believer that it can't just be down to individual parents to provide their kids with this education either, because the harsh reality of the situation is, one, parents aren't experts in every field and they aren't always up to date with their information. And this includes difficult topics like drugs and sex and so on. Two, parents don't always know the best way to communicate with and reach out to their kids. They can tell them stuff, but they might not actually get through to them because, strangely enough, parents don't get training before they become parents. Three, not everyone is a good parent, and I know this is a controversial thing to say, and people look at me as a non-parent myself and say, well, who are you to criticize? But as a former kid, I can say, not all parents are good parents. Not all parents know what is best for their kids. And as someone who has been pretty severely damaged over the years by parenting decisions that my own parents made, I'm a big believer that Yeah, not all parents are good, and we need to acknowledge this. And we can't just rely on parents as individuals for everything. We need to provide actual trained people who can educate our kids in a lot of circumstances, because I don't trust all parents to know what is right for their kids all of the time. Some do, sure, some are great parents, but not everyone is. And I don't think it's worth taking a chance and saying, well, we'll just leave all kids alone, because chances are some of the parents are going to be good. What I'm trying to say is this is why I'm a big advocate of educational programs run by people who are, one, trained to teach kids in an effective manner, and two, experts in the field they're teaching, especially when it comes to these difficult topics, like, for example, puberty, drug use, alcohol awareness, teaching them about other lifestyle and health issues. For me, I remember like one of my most vivid memories from school was when this police officer came in to give us a drug talk, right? And he was just incredibly frank with us. He was very like straightforward, and he told us, these are what drugs are, this is what they look like, here's how they're used, here are the effects, here's why people take them, here's what it will do to you in the short and long term. And afterwards we could go up to this table and look at these like actual samples of the drugs in these little super glued boxes that he brought in, so that we could like learn how to identify them, right? And that was like a big eye-opener for me, because I'd heard the names of these things before, but I honestly didn't really know about them in the real world. They were these scary things that like, oh, we have to make a Stop Drugs Now poster in Citizenship, or on Emmerdale, there's this person who smoked the weed once and then they dropped out of school. Ooh, how bad. But I didn't really know about it on like a real life level. It wasn't something that I'd seen there in front of me. So honestly, I didn't really have a clue. If I'd gone into a room and seen a bunch of people shoving needles in their arms, I probably wouldn't have had a clue what they were actually doing. If someone had offered me a pill in a club, I wouldn't have known what that pill was, because I'd never really seen these things before. I hadn't been educated. I didn't know what it was. Things like heroin or MDMA or ecstasy or even like cocaine and weed were abstract concepts to me at this point. But once they became real and I could see them in front of me, and suddenly I was like, oh, this is what that is. That meant that when I did grow up and go out into the real world, and people did offer me things at parties and in clubs and that sort of thing, I was prepared to say, you know what? I know what this does. I know where I'm at in my life right now. I am going to make the informed decision to say no thank you. And that's what I did, and it's been helpful. But like I say, this isn't just true for drugs. Drugs is just one area where I think comprehensive education is important. It's true for so many topics, and difficult topics, which people are trying to ban teachers and educational professionals and just like states in general talking about, like sex education, periods, puberty, relationships, understanding gender and sexuality. And it's insane to me that they're trying to ban professionals from talking about this to kids in a way that is going to make them feel safe and secure and informed and grow up to be really productive members of society with great self-esteem who understand the issues that they're facing every day. That's what educating kids is about. It's not about trying to push them one way or another. It's about giving them or it should be about giving them all the information, giving them the tools they need to analyze it for themselves so they can grow up and face the issues that they will face with all the knowledge they actually need. Now, this video is inspired by the absolutely insane laws and rules they're trying to put in place in Florida at the minute, and those which are already in place there and in other states and in other countries around the world. This Florida thing is just kind of bringing it to the forefront at the minute, but it's by far not the only place where this is an issue and will continue to be an issue. Even UK MPs have had discussions about really similar things recently. And again, not just our countries, all over the world, these things are banned. If you've seen the first video in my series of like why we still need feminism video, you'll see that in so many countries, just sex education doesn't exist. Access to sexual health, like resources, doesn't exist for so many women. And it's a problem. But let's have a look at this Florida one as an example, and then we'll talk a little bit more. Florida lawmakers are considering a draft law to strengthen state control over sex education that its sponsor says would ban any instruction in schools about menstrual cycles before the 6th grade. The proposal comes as Florida's Republican-dominated legislature, backed by Governor Ron DeSantis, has already passed a raft of laws limiting discussion in school of gender, sexuality, and reducing the emphasis on diversity in public schools. The latest proposal from the Republican Stan McClain would allow instruction in acquired immune deficiency syndrome, sexually transmitted diseases, or health education only in grades 6 through 12, generally meaning for children aged 12 to 18. McClain confirmed at a recent committee meeting that discussions about menstrual cycles would also be restricted to those grades. Now, call me crazy, but this is absolutely stupid. I cannot see any good reason for doing this at all. 6th grade, which I googled is our year 7, so ages like 11 to 12-ish. When you consider that the average age of a girl getting her period is between 10 and 15 years old, and for some it's younger, that's the average. For some girls it is younger, and you're stopping schools from teaching them about that. You're literally stopping kids from learning about something or being able to talk to their teachers about actual things that are happening within their bodies and their friends' bodies at that time. There is no good reason to ban that. Something like a period shouldn't be taboo. It shouldn't be this hush-hush thing that, oh no, you're not old enough to hear about that yet. It's a bodily function in the same way that eating and peeing and vomiting is, you know? In the same way that crying is, in the same way that digesting your food is, in the same way that when we get a cold our noses run. Periods are just a part of how our body works, and there's no reason we should age restrict that, especially when it's happening to girls under the age you're wanting to restrict it to, you know? Periods aren't a pleasant experience at all. You bleed, sometimes a lot, sometimes with horrible clotting. You get cramps, sometimes these can be debilitating. Sometimes you get nausea, vomiting, an upset tummy, bloating, dizziness, headaches, mood swings, and God knows what else. It differs from person to person. Now, imagine you're a 10-year-old girl, 9-year-old, even 8-year-old, and this starts happening to you, and you haven't been pre-warned about what it is, why it's happening, or how to manage it. You haven't had an education. That is going to be terrifying. Now imagine on top of that, you go running to your teacher, and by law, they're not actually allowed to talk to you about what is happening in your body. How is that protecting or helping any kid? It sounds like some sort of dystopian nightmare, but this is the absolute bizarre reality of the law being proposed. And I'm sorry, but no, you can't just leave it up to individual parents to try and educate their kids about this, because not all parents do. My parents never did. I have never once had a conversation with my parents, my mum, my family, anyone, about like periods or sex education or anything like that. I still remember being like 23 and being embarrassed to tell my sister that I needed to go and buy pads while we were on holiday because I got my period. That's how like taboo things are in my family, and you just don't really talk about that stuff. I'm trying to change that now as I'm getting older and like be less ashamed of it and just be like, yeah, this is what's happening, blah blah blah. But for a long time it was difficult, and I think you'd be surprised how many kids come from families like mine where that stuff just isn't spoken about at all. I remember when we first had a sex ed talk in school and we learned about periods and how to manage them and what our options were and what was going on and all that sort of thing. I actually went into this whole like internal panic and like completely shut down and like refused to speak to anyone for like a day because I was petrified, not over the possibility of me getting my period, but because I was scared when I get my period, how do I tell my mum? How do I get what I need? How do I speak to my family about this? That's what terrified me and messed me up. Luckily, I didn't really have to deal with that. I was very late getting my period. I was like 16 before I got my first period, actually nearly 17. And by that point, I'd been working in a local pharmacy for like 2, nearly 3 years at that point. So I was able to sort myself out. Everything was good. But without sex education in school and without access to high quality books to explain to me what was going on, I would have been absolutely screwed. There's no way around it. I didn't have any adults in my life to talk to. My parents weren't talking to me about it. My sister wasn't talking to me about it. No one spoke to me about it. I had to get my education from school. I had to get it from, good quality books that explain this stuff to me. refusing to teach kids about things like periods doesn't stop them from happening. All it does is instill feelings of fear and shame where there shouldn't be any. Getting your period is nothing to be ashamed of, and it took me far too long to actually realise that and be able to say it out loud. Where I am now as a woman who's turning 30 next week is so far removed from where I was as that terrified little 10, 11-year-old girl learning about periods for the first time. And I would hope that with good quality education, everyone can get to a place like where I am now, rather than where I was, you know? Periods are a completely normal part of life that every individual should learn about, whether they themselves get periods or not. It's important to be informed and to have compassion for the people around you who are going through having a period, even if it's not your time yet or you're never going to have one, you know? I never thought kids learning about what is happening in their own bodies on a biological level would be controversial, but here we are, I guess. But it's not just education about puberty and periods and that sort of thing. It's actual education about sex, STIs, pregnancy, contraception, and sexuality too, that is already being banned in so many states, that is already banned in countries around the world, that is, you know, looking a bit iffy here in the UK too. And this sort of education is important. Once again, I'm a big believer that kids need to be informed about these things. And I can't believe I even have to say this, but proper education on these topics absolutely will not encourage any kids to go out there and have sex too young and catch all the STIs like their Pokemon, but it will keep them safe. Kids aren't going to learn, ooh, this is what sex is, better go out and do it tonight. If you're doing sex education properly, a big part of that is informing them about how they know that they're ready, how they know how to pick the right partner, understanding what consent is, how to be safe, and that it's absolutely okay to say no and to wait for as long as you want. And it's also important to teach them that not everyone wants to have sex. Plenty of people are asexual, and that's okay too. And everything in between, you know? Again, just like periods, things like STIs and pregnancy and sex are gonna exist in the world whether we tell kids about them or not. The only difference is that when kids are educated on these topics properly, they grow up to be able to make safe, informed choices for themselves. Studies literally show, and I quote, comprehensive sex education is associated with lower pregnancy risks, a later age at first sex, and an increased probability of contraceptive use. Sources are down in the video description, by the way. How is any of that a bad thing? It's been proven that comprehensive education works. Why are we not doing it more? Why are we placing more and more restrictions on it, or trying to? Again, I'm one of those people whose parents never spoke to me about any of that sort of stuff, and to this day I am, again, almost 30, and I don't think I've ever said the word sex to my parents. It's just not been discussed. So I had to get all my knowledge and everything that I needed from sex education at school and through books and figuring things out by myself, you know? Again, this is what I say, you can't leave it up to the parents, because plenty of people have parents like mine that will screw you up. If it weren't for other resources, I'd have been more messed up than I was. Because that's the thing, my parents never bringing the topic up never stopped me being curious, and it never stopped me actually having sex. In fact, I'd argue that the only reason I have such a safe and healthy attitude towards sex today, and that I had a safe and healthy attitude towards it when I was a teenager, was because my school did actually provide great sex education. My school had a lot of faults. It was very bad. Oh, the standards were in the gutter. But one thing it did well was good sex education, and I can't fault them for that. I personally think, and there are a lot of sources that back this up, a lot of studies that back this up, that it's better to provide this sort of education before any kid ever has to come into contact with this stuff in the real world. Tell them what a period is before they have one. Tell them what sex is before someone tries to pressure them into it. Tell them what an STI is before they're at risk of catching one. Tell them what pregnancy is and how you get pregnant before it might potentially happen to them. Education for prevention is far better than shaming people who were ignorant and find themselves having these problems. A lot of people might say things like, oh, well, why does a child need to know about STIs? Can't they wait until they're an adult? As an example. To which I have to say, sure, you're right. It would be so great if no kid ever had to hear about an STI. If no person did. If not educating people about it just wiped them from existence, I'd be like, yes, let's do it. Let's absolutely do it. But it doesn't work that way. It would also be great if no child was at risk until they were an adult. But again, it doesn't work that way. The reality of the situation is teenagers will have sex, whether we want them to or not. It's gonna happen. And so we need to provide them with the tools they need to do this safely and make informed choices if this is what they decide to do. The other harsh reality is that some kids are abused. Again, it would be great if this didn't happen, but it does. In the horrible real world, it does. And plenty of people use the naivety and ignorance of kids to get away with it for far longer than they ever should. If we teach kids about what the physical act of sex is, why adults choose to do it, what the good things about it are, what the risks are, about consent, about how to recognize STIs, about the importance of being tested, about the importance of using contraceptives, and so on. If we teach them that sort of thing, they'll be more able to recognize, even from a younger age, if they or someone they know are being abused or groomed or pressured into something that they don't want to do. If we give them this information, then they'll be more able to identify it and they'll be more able to report it and get help without feeling any sort of shame or fear, you know? When you make sex in general a taboo topic, you make even victims of sexual assault feel ashamed of it, and that's not okay. You make them feel like they did something wrong, which is absolutely never the case. Stigmatizing all sex makes people who enjoy sex and also victims of sexual violence all feel shame. And that's not okay. That's not healthy. That's not helpful. It doesn't keep anyone safe. I actually grew up reading a lot of Jacqueline Wilson books, which, let's be honest, would probably be banned in a lot of American states today if she was popular over there. As an adult, I've actually started going back and rereading a few of these books and being like, okay, well, like, do they live up to what I remember as a kid and this sort of thing, and like reading some of her newer books that I was too old for when I was a kid and stuff like that, and oh my god, they are still brilliant. They are good. Jacqueline Wilson gets kids. She is an incredible writer who captures the voice of kids perfectly, the experience of kids. She gets it. She knows how to speak to them and make them feel heard and listened to and safe. And I love that. Jacqueline's books do talk about really difficult topics that kids do have to go through in real life. And she writes about it in a way that is so relatable, not at all shaming or stigmatizing. Her books show kids how to get help, where the support is, and they usually have a nice happy ending with a message of hope. Usually. There's stories about kids whose parents are divorcing, kids growing up in the care system, kids who have behavioural problems, health problems, food and weight issues, first-time relationships, dealing with other kids who are bullies or a bad influence, kids who grew up with abusive or neglectful parents, kids who grew up with alcoholic parents. There's absolutely all sorts, and they're so good. Inspired by this exact video that I'm making now, I recently read one of Jacqueline Wilson's more recent books, which was written long after I was already a proper grown-up, called Baby Love, and I remember this was like slightly controversial, I think, when she released it, but it was aimed at a slightly older audience than most of her books, and it tells the story of this young girl growing up in the 60s in England, and she's from a pretty poor working class family with very overprotective parents who just want to like shelter her and keep her naive and even though this book is set like 3 decades before I was born, when I was reading it I was like, damn, this is my childhood. This is me. And I related a hell of a lot to the main character. I thought that was interesting. There's also the fact that she looks like way, way younger than her age, and she kind of feels like a bit of an ugly duckling and a bit plain, and she has this beautiful, glamorous friend, and in comparison, she's just like a plain little, like, child. I related to that. I was like, yes, that was me. That was absolutely me. Anyway, at 14, she meets this older boy at a swimming pool, and he's somewhere around 18, I think we're told. And because she's not had any sex education at this point, no education around consent or relationships or anything, she doesn't really know what's happening. He's completely in control, completely in charge. He takes advantage of that, and she gets in trouble for it. He gets her alone, starts kissing her, which at first she quite likes, because she's like, oh, this does feel nice, this is good. But before she knows what's happening, he's basically forcing himself on her. Even afterwards, she doesn't really know what's happened. She doesn't really know for sure if it was sex. She felt pain. She heard him sigh afterwards. But she doesn't really know what exactly happened to her. She doesn't know that it was sex, never mind that this was actually rape. She doesn't have the words for this, she doesn't know how to describe it, she doesn't fully understand anything that happened to her because she's ignorant through no fault of her own. And when she falls pregnant from, and we're going to call it what it is, this rape, she doesn't actually even realise she's pregnant until she's about 4 months along and gets a checkup from the doctor, because no one's ever really told her before how you get pregnant or what the signs of pregnancy are. Then, because it's the 60s and she's this 14-year-old pregnant girl, there's literally no support for her. Everyone shames her, her parents are horrific, and they send her away to this home to have a baby, and then they try to get it adopted even though she wants to keep it, and she's just given no control over her body, her life, anything. And we see the stories of the other girls who are there in the home as well and in the same situation, and again, none of them had proper sex education, and now they're facing the consequences. Some of them had boyfriends that they loved, but they were never taught about using protection or how pregnancy really worked. They believed all these myths about, you can't get pregnant standing up, you can't get pregnant the first time, and now they're pregnant. Some of them were groomed and abused by authority figures in their life. Like, there's a story of this young 15-year-old-ish Christian girl who was repeatedly raped by her church's youth group leader, who then blamed her for seducing him, and she got sent away and shamed for her pregnancy and called a sinning harlot, despite the fact he was an adult man abusing her and she didn't really understand what was happening to her. And sure, this book is fiction, but all the stories in it were inspired by what life was really like back then, before we had proper, comprehensive sex education in schools, before we had access to contraceptives and legal abortion, before we had proper healthcare for this. None of those young women and girls got in that situation in the book because they were bad kids, or because they just weren't sheltered enough. All of them got in that situation because they were naive, they were ignorant, and they lacked a support system to really help them understand what was happening to them, and this was taken advantage of by the people around them. And this is the reality of what will happen again if laws like the one they want to pass in Florida become a reality again. This is what will happen if we keep reducing what we can educate our kids on. Or actually, no, I would say today it's maybe even going to be worse, because this isn't the 60s anymore. Nowadays, kids have access to phones and the internet constantly. And let's be honest, no matter how much you try and shelter your kid, they're always going to be curious about sex and their body and relationships and all these things, and they're going to try and find out some information for themselves. So you as a parent need to ask yourself, if your kid is going to be learning about sex anyway, and they are, that is the reality, they are, where would you rather they learn about it from? Who would you rather they learn about it from? What would you rather they're learning? Do you want them to hear about this stuff from a qualified teacher and a sex education expert who's had CRB checks and is up to date with all the information they need, and whose only intention and motive is wanting to keep your kids safe and healthy? Or do you want them going online, looking things up on Google, and coming across absolutely any type of unregulated information out there, including pornography? And yes, not just random porn, but also porn that includes non-consensual content and content which exploits women. Is that how you want your kids learning sex education? Or what about if they go online and they start asking people on forums and they start connecting with other people and talking about it? What if they're learning their sex education from individuals who might be grooming your kids, or who are motivated by their own gross desires, who can tell them anything they want because, this is unregulated and your kid is just hearing it from a potential groomer and predator? So you have to, as a parent, make a choice. Do you want your child to remain sheltered and ignorant, which could very easily be taken advantage of by the wrong people? Do you want them getting their information from unregulated and potentially harmful sources? Or do you want them getting comprehensive and safe, formal sex education? I know which one I'd rather pick for my niece and nephew. I know which one I'd rather I had when I was younger. I know which one I did have when I was younger, thankfully. Obviously, the last one is the best choice, the safest choice, the one that is going to help the most people. So why are people trying to ban it? It's not just sex education that's being blocked, though. It's also any education around sexuality and gender. So some states in America and in other countries have a ban or are trying to ban education around this up to much higher ages. there's some bizarre idea that by teaching kids, hey, gay and transgender people exist, that somehow puts kids in danger. No, that's not how it works. The opposite is in fact true. Stats do show that more people than ever are identifying as part of the LGBT plus community. Check out the UK census data down in the video description if you want some more information on that. I only have the UK stats, but I think this is true in quite a lot of countries too, from what I've seen. But these increased numbers aren't because people are being turned gay or whatever else random conservatives want you to think. It's simply because it's safer to come out now. That's all there is to it. People are more accepting now, so people feel safer being themselves. The numbers of gay, bisexual, transgender, and gender non-conforming people and so on probably exist in roughly the same proportion of the population that they always have. The only difference is more people are being open and honest about it. That's all. Obviously, we still have a long way to go, but that's the reason that numbers have been increasing. That's all. People feel safer. How is that a bad thing? I can't believe it's 2023 and I'm having to like literally sit here and say that sexuality and gender isn't something you pick or choose. It's just who you are, but here I am saying it. There you go. So educating kids on sexuality and gender isn't going to turn anyone into anything. It's not going to force people to change their gender or sexuality or whatever you think it's going to be. It's just going to make people feel safer, happier, and more comfortable expressing themselves as they are. And that does include kids who are cis and heterosexual. They're going to feel more comfortable in themselves as well. And it's going to make all kids more accepting of the others around them. Again, how is that a bad thing? I don't know about anyone else, but I don't see any downsides to that. When people feel more accepted for who they are, when people are more accepted by the people around them, their mental health is much better, happiness rates are increased, people are more productive members of society, rates of self-harm and suicides drop drastically. These are all really, really good things that we should be encouraging. If you want to find out more information, I'll link an interesting paper about suicide risk factors amongst LGBT plus people in the video description and what can be done to reduce it if you want to find out a little bit more. When you literally stop people being educated and talking about things like different sexualities, different gender identities and so on, all you do is make the kids and young people and even adults who are questioning theirs feel ashamed, confused, alone, and all this does is cause more problems. It leads to bullying, it leads to depression, it leads to anxiety, it leads to increased risks of self-harm and suicide. But if you give your kids a safe place to ask questions, to learn about other people and to figure out their identity for themselves, then they're going to be so much happier and healthier. And isn't that ultimately what we want? Now, a lot of people at this point, and by a lot of people I mean mostly conservatives, jump straight on the, oh, so you want to mutilate kids' genitals? Because they like being hyperbolic and ridiculous, but no, of course not. No one's saying that, no one wants that. That's stupid. Stop strawmanning. No one is saying that providing education on topics around sexuality and gender identity, that kids should be able to have any kind of gender-affirming surgery. No one is saying kids should be forced into that. No one's even saying kids should be allowed that. We're just talking about the education here. We're not even talking about if kids should be able to go through medical transition or not. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm going to leave those conversations to the experts who actually know what they're talking about there. I'm not one of them. All I'm talking about here is pure education. Telling kids, hey, some people are transgender. This is what it means. This is how you make sure you're being respectful and accepting of these people. If you question your gender identity yourself, here are some resources where you can safely learn about it and talk to some people who can help you understand your feelings and work through it at your own pace. Saying to kids, hey, some people have different sexualities, some people experience these things differently. This is all okay. This is what it means. This is how you accept others. This is how you figure out for yourself what you're feeling. Here are some resources if you want to talk through your own feelings with someone. That's it. That's what the education's about. There's no crazy, I don't know, like ulterior motive or there's no one wanting to endanger kids. There's no one wanting to force anything on kids. It's just teaching kids about acceptance and understanding themselves and understanding the world around them. In the same way we teach kids that there are people of different races, ages, abilities, backgrounds, and so on, teach them that there are people of different genders and sexualities, and that's okay. Absolutely fine. Normal. But by banning all of this kind of education around puberty and periods and sexuality and gender. It is not an exaggeration to say you are literally putting kids and their lives and health in danger. How are we today at a point in 2023 where teaching young people about basic health, safety and lifestyle needs is somehow controversial? How are we at a point where teaching people to be accepting of yourself and others is somehow controversial? It's ridiculous and it's dangerous. But anyway, I know I've been rambling a lot through this video and this has been more of me just like kind of having a rant at you, but hopefully this video has given you something to think about and taught you that the only way to combat ignorance and naivety and stupidity is through education, and that needs to start early. It needs to start before young people encounter these problems in the real world. We need to give them the tools to care for themselves and look after themselves and make informed decisions. That's our responsibility as adults, to look after the younger generations, or at least I think it should be. That's where I'm going to end this today. So thank you so much for watching, thank you for your time, I do appreciate you a lot. If you're sticking around for more of my series about why we still need feminism, don't worry, that is absolutely coming. It's just the video scripts take a really long time to write and research and all that stuff, so it's taken me a little while, but it is something I'm working on and stuff like that. I am going away next week for, oh my god, my first proper holiday in, I don't even know how many years. Oh god, I need it so much. I think I'm really heading towards burnout at the minute. I'm exhausted, I'm not sleeping properly, I'm working way too much, and me and Kieran did have like 2 nights in Paris at the end of last year, but I haven't had like a proper week's holiday in I don't even know how long. I think maybe 5 years. So I am ready for this. I need it so badly. But I'm going to Gibraltar with my partner and a whole bunch of people, my sister, her soon-to-be wife. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be my 30th while we're there, and also my sister's getting married, which is very exciting. So it's going to be a wonderful week. It's going to be hopefully very relaxed. I think I need a break. So I don't know how much of a chance I'm going to have to like make videos and schedule them for that next week. I've got so much to do this week that I'm going to try and get stuff done, but if not, I'm sorry, I apologise, but I'm going to be working as hard as I can and trying to get stuff out for you. So yeah, there you go, that's a little life update, and that's also why I look kind of just like a bit scruffy and like thrown together today, because I am exhausted. Okay, anyway, that's me done for today. If you liked the video, please leave a like, don't forget to subscribe, check you're still subscribed if you've been around for a while, and leave a comment because engagement really helps, and I am not even quite sure what I'm saying anymore because I'm just exhausted. But thank you for watching, I appreciate you a lot, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!